In this video, we review Azure Basic Firewall. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Raltos. Azure recently announced the general availability of the Basic Firewall SKU. In this video, we review the Azure Basic Firewall and then deploy it in a demo. If you like these videos, or just this one for that matter, I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. I also have courses on Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 365, and hybrid identities with Azure AD at udemy.com. Links are below. And a shout out to all my channel members, your support is appreciated. Until now, Azure firewalls were quite an investment. Worth it, especially for large organizations that want a native, highly available firewall solution with central management in Azure. But for small and medium-sized organizations, the price could be a barrier. That changes with a basic SKU of Azure Firewall. The Basic Firewall offers Layer 3 and Layer 7 filtering and alerts on malicious traffic with Microsoft Threat Intelligence. It's cloud native and supports availability zones in regions where they're supported. And multiple firewalls can be managed with Azure Firewall Manager. The Azure Firewall uses rules to control traffic in and out of the firewall. These rules are grouped into rule collections. The rule collections and rules in the collections are processed in order, specifying an allow or deny action based on the rule condition. The default for all firewall traffic, including access to Azure services, is to deny. There are three types of rules: DNAT, network, and application. DNAT provides the ability to allow inbound traffic through the firewall. Hosting a website, for example, it uses an inbound translation rule to direct traffic from the internet to a resource behind the firewall. The network rule uses layer 3 and 4 information to allow or deny inbound, outbound, or east to west traffic. These rules are based on IP address, port, and protocols. Finally, application rules are layer 7 rules that allow or deny inbound, outbound, or east to west traffic using fully qualified domain names, URLs, and web protocols. The rule groups are processed in this order by default: DNAT, then network, and lastly, applications. When a rule is matched, the action is taken and the processing stops. Also, the Azure Basic Firewall uses SNAT for outbound access, so all public traffic comes from the firewall's public IP address. The standard and premium SKU work the same, only with some additional features. Let's look at the features and what makes basic, well, basic. Throughput depends on a few variables such as the number and type of connections, but total bandwidth is 250 megabits per second for the basic SKU, 3 gigs per second for standard and premium. Standard will scale up to 30 gigabits per second, and premium will scale to 100 gigabits per second. On the screen is a chart that outlines the difference between the three SKUs. It's worth pointing out a couple of the features not available with a basic firewall. First, the web categories are not available on basic. A web category is a list of websites on specific topics that Microsoft manages. Administrators can use these categories to create, deny, or allow rules for web traffic. For example, a rule could allow finance, news, and government websites, but block gambling, alcohol, and tobacco sites. Web categories are not available with basic, so our options are to block web traffic, allow all web traffic, or manually define sites to allow or block. Another option is to use a solution such as Defender. Next, threat intelligence-based filtering only provides an alert action. That requires user intervention to respond to those alerts. If those or any other missing features are required for the deployment, a standard or premium SKU is a better option. Let's review the requirements next. We need at least 3 subnets on a VNet to deploy and use the firewall. We need the Azure Firewall subnet. The subnet has to have that exact name, and a /26 or larger subnet. The firewall service may need extra addresses as it scales out. Also required for the basic firewall is a subnet with the name Azure Firewall Management Subnet that's /26 or larger. The basic firewall splits management and firewall traffic because of the limited bandwidth. Management and logging tasks won't interfere with internet traffic. For the demo coming up, the environment has those subnets in a VNet and also a workload subnet for the client we test with. We need to configure a route table and default route that directs outbound internet traffic through the firewall. The route table is then applied to the workload subnet. Don't apply it to the firewall or a management subnet. After that, we need to configure traffic rules. We'll walk through that with examples that allow outbound web and DNS traffic and allow inbound traffic with a DNAT rule. Let's jump into the Azure portal to get started. Here we are in the portal, and we'll start with the VNet. We have 3 subnets for testing. If you're not sure why we have 3 subnets, rewind a bit. Notice one of them is named Azure Firewall Management Subnet. That name is a requirement to deploy a basic firewall. It's the same case for Azure Firewall Subnet. We need to have 2 subnets with those names to deploy a basic Azure firewall. The entire /24 block isn't required, but this is a demo environment, so I don't have to worry about saving IPs. Let's create a new resource and search for firewall. We'll select firewall and create. Make sure your subscription and resource group is selected. The firewall has to be in the same resource group as the VNet. Give the firewall a name, basic FW for this example. Select the region. It has to be the same as the VNet we're attaching it to, West US 3 for this example. Select one or more availability zones to deploy it to. Availability zones may not be supported in every region. I'll select all. We can scroll down. Set the firewall SKU to basic. That's because we're deploying a basic firewall. For firewall policy, let's add a new one. Give it a name, basic FW policy for this example. Set the region the same as the firewall in the VNet. And we only have one option for the policy tier for a basic firewall, and that's a basic tier. We'll click OK. You could add a virtual network when you deploy the firewall, but I'm going to use an existing one. We'll select the virtual network. Basic FW VNet for this example. We'll give it a new public IP address, and that will be FW-PIP. We also need to give it a management public IP address. We'll add new, and we'll call this FW Management PIP. Click OK. Let's move on to tags. We can enter tag values. I'll mark that for my lab. Go next to review and create, and create. This may take a few minutes, so I'll pause here and come back once it's done. The firewall's finished. Before we move on, we need some IP addresses. Go to the resource. Make note of the private IP address. We'll need that shortly. Also, go into public IP configuration. And make a note of the public IP address. We'll also need that coming up shortly. Once you have those IP addresses recorded, we can create a default route to direct internet traffic to the firewall. This is required for Azure firewalls as well as any network virtual appliance or NVAs, such as a third-party firewall. Go to create a resource, and we'll search for route tables. And add a route table. We'll create that. Select your subscription and set it to the same resource group as the VNet. Select your region, and that also should be the same region as the VNet. Give it a name, FW route for this example. You can add tags as needed, and then go to review and create. And once validation passes, click create. That will create our route table. We'll give it a minute to finish. That finished. Next, we have to associate the route table to the workload subnet. That's the subnet our test VM is in. In larger environments, we'll have to attach the route table to any subnet that has clients that need to access the internet through the firewall. But don't apply the routing table to the Azure Firewall or Azure Firewall Management subnet, just the workload subnet. Let's go to the resource, go to subnets, select associate, make sure our VNet is set, and we'll select the workload subnet. So that's the subnet our clients are on. And OK. Next, go to routes, and we're going to add a route. Give it a name. This one will be FW-DR. We'll select the destination IP address and add 0.0.0.0/0. That's the default route. In next hop, select virtual appliance. Add the private internal IP address for the Azure Firewall. That's the private IP address we made a note of earlier. Click Add. This tells the VNet to send any traffic that it doesn't have a route for to the firewall. Now we can start creating our firewall rules. We'll start with an application rule. Let's go to the firewall. Here we are in the firewall. Open our firewall policy, basic FW policy for this example. From here, go to application rules. Rules are grouped into collections. Let's start by creating a new collection called AppCOL01. Make sure the type is application and give it a priority, 500 for this example. Rule collections are processed in order. It's a good idea to leave space in front of the rule collection in case we need to add a rule before this in the order it's processed. Leave the action set to allow and go down to name. This is where the basic firewall becomes, well, basic. By default, the firewall blocks all traffic, inbound and outbound. With the basic firewall, we have to specify the sites we want to allow our users to access. I don't think anyone keeps a detailed list of all the sites users visit. We can add FQDN tags that allows access to Azure services. This is helpful if we want to block all traffic to the internet, but allow our clients to access Azure services. With AVD, for example, the session host could still access the AVD service, although it's called Windows Virtual Desktop here, but it's the same thing. The standard and premium firewalls offer web categories, so we can allow traffic to known good sites based on the category, like news or productivity or shopping. But that's not an option with the basic firewall. For this example, we're going to add a rule that allows all outbound web traffic. Is that a good idea? Maybe, maybe not. But unless you're locking down all internet access, with some exceptions, this option will allow our users to access the internet without having to add each site manually. We'll change this back to FQDN. Give it a name, all web out. The source type is IP address, and under source we can add a single IP address or a subnet. We could also add the asterisk for all. For this example, I'm going to be a little bit more restrictive and add the VNet address space. That's 10.1.0.0/16 for this environment. That way any client on the VNet will be able to access the internet. For protocol, we'll add HTTP and HTTPS. You don't have to add the port, separate them with a comma. Leave the destination as FQDN and set the destination to any or just an asterisk. We'll add the rule. One other thing, we can't order rules or add a rule ahead of another. These rules we add to a collection are processed in order. So plan ahead and start with the most specific rule first. Let's move on to the network rule next. The network rule is a layer 3 or port and protocol rule. We'll add outbound DNS for this example. Let's add a rule collection. Give it a name, netcol01 for this example. Leave the rule collection type as network and set the priority to 500. We'll leave the action to allow and set the collection group to default network rule collection group. Now we'll create the rule, give it a name, DNS out. We'll set the source type as IP address, and we'll add the VNet address space to the scope. For protocol, we'll set it to UDP, and destination port is 53 for DNS. Leave the destination as IP address. I'll just use an asterisk to allow all outbound DNS queries. If you have specific public DNS servers, you can add them instead. Click Add. That creates the DNS network rule. Next, we'll create a DNAT rule. This is optional, and what I'm going to show you is probably not recommended. I'm going to allow RDP port 3389N. If you want to see a lot of failed login attempts, leave port 3389 open to the internet. For this demo, it's fine though. A better option to connect to an Azure VM behind a firewall is Azure Bastion, but that wouldn't make for a good demo. We'll add an RDP rule so we can log into the VM and test outbound access. Go to DNAT rules and add a new rule collection. Give it a name. We'll call it DNAT COL01. The collection type is DNAT. Priority is 500. Set the rule collection group to default DNAT rule collection group. We'll add the rule. We'll call it RDPN. We'll select the source address and use the wildcard asterisk, but you could add a known public IP address if you want to limit what public IP address can log into this VM. For protocol, we'll select TCP, and port is 3389. Let's scroll over. The destination type is IP address, and set the destination IP address to the public IP address of the firewall. And remember, we made a note of that earlier. This is a translation rule, so it will translate the destination public IP address to an internal private IP address. The private IP address we want that to translate to is the VM we're trying to log into. And for my example, that's 10.1.2.4, the internal private IP address of the VM we're going to log into. And we'll translate that to the same port, 3389. Once that's ready, we can hit add, and that adds the rule. Now we have rule collections for each rule type. There's the rule that allows outbound web. There's the rule that allows outbound DNS. And there's the rule that allows inbound RDP. The rules can take a minute to finish applying. I'll pause here and come back once the inbound rule has applied. Okay, the rule collection is finished applying. Now that we have the basic configuration in place, we can test. Let's start by connecting to the computer behind the firewall with RDP. We'll open up the RDP client, and we'll go to the public IP address of the firewall. We get a login screen. That's a good sign. And it looks like we can log in. And we are going to the public IP address of the firewall. That's good. Now let's open up a web browser. Okay, from the web browser, we're going to open up a site that will tell us what our public IP address is. That site is ipchicken.com. That's our client's public IP address, and that matches the firewall's public IP address. That's good. That means our rules are working. That is how to configure the Azure Basic Firewall. As you may have noticed, the Basic Firewall is just that, basic. It's a better than nothing option at an affordable price, a good option for small and medium-sized companies that need a firewall without some of the advanced functionality. I hope this helps you better understand the Basic Firewall. Thanks for watching.